Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.
You're listening to Tony Graham on Binjang 91.5, and it's time for us to have our discussion, as I might like to refer to it, because what we will be talking about is discussions. And I've got Matthew Dickinson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council, on the line here, and they had their council standing committee meetings last night where they have these discussions and recommendations that go to the full council meeting, which will be in 2 weeks' time. So, generally speaking, these are very important meetings because it comes out with all the important informations and recommendations, and they usually do get voted in, maybe with a few changes perhaps, or a few debates. Maybe some are heated. I don't know. Anyway, Matthew, how are you going today?
Good, thank you, Tony. It's a good point you make there that these discussions are a great chance for the community to hear the thoughts from councillors and also to get an indication of which way that it might go. You're quite right. These aren't resolutions. In 2 weeks' time, the final resolution will occur. And so if people have got some views on this and they hear what councillors are thinking, they've got the chance to talk to councillors before the final resolution is made. So important meetings, as you said, absolutely I agree.
Yeah, you might say they're the first filter that comes to the councillors, or to some of them anyway, at a committee level, from the actual management of council itself. So the reports and everything else, that's their first filter. So there's a preliminary discussion about those things before it goes to the main council meeting.
Exactly right. Hit the nail on the head.
Now, Matthew, of course, of great interest in Wellington is what's happening with the low-level bridge, or the Duke of Wellington Bridge, as it's also known as, because there's been, 2 reports now from the Snowy Mountains engineering body, whatever they call themselves, but they certainly have come up with these reports after, 9 months now, and it's very interesting to look at the results of those and the recommendations. So tell us all about that.
Yeah, sure. So SMEC is the company that has done that preliminary information or preliminary reports for us. And it had to, we've been through some workshops, but it has to get to the point where council makes a decision on what to do. And of course, there are a number of options, and we've talked about those before, Tony. Some of those options aren't great. Do nothing, for example, is an option, or remove the bridge altogether. But what we did last night was we talked about where we might go with this, and we need to give our staff some direction. The decision last night at the council meeting was to essentially go forward and look at how we might get the bridge and the entrances. The bridge is still fine. The entrances to the bridge back to how they were, basically build up those riverbanks, put some treatments in place to protect those from future flows of the Bell River there. So essentially, the recommendation from the committee meeting was that we go out, we target natural disaster funding to basically reinstate the riverbank and the Gabaldon Street pavement and all the damage that was done by the floods and the storms, and get it back to how it was before, and also treat it in such a way that it can withstand future flooding, because we know we're going to have that flooding again, Tony. We know we're going to have some of those high water flows again, so we need to have that point. Now, the estimation for all of this is in the vicinity of $21.6 million. That's not an amount of money that council has sitting around in loose change ready to spend on a project like this. So the first point is that we will, again, based on the recommendation last night, target natural disaster funding, and there may be some other funds we'll work on as well, but that'll be the first port of call, and go down that path and see how successful we are there. The intent from councillors last night was absolutely to get that bridge back to its former glory and obviously be able to access that and use that as a second crossing across the Macquarie River. So that's our intention. We've just got to work out a way to fund it.
Yeah, okay. The interesting part about that, of course, was the options more or less led to the recommendation, because when you look at the cost of doing anything with that bridge, it was do nothing, $50,000. Decommission the bridge was $23.4 million. And that was including removing the structure and undertaking bank stabilisation work. Well, just decommission the bridge, retain the structure and undertake bank stabilisation works was $21.4 million. And income's $21.6 million just to reinstate the bridge and the road access. and fix up the bank and bridge stabilisation work. So really the cheapest option, apart from do nothing.
Correct. And that's, you hit the nail on the head. Whatever we did, do nothing doesn't seem like a very sensible option, because as that riverbank has fallen away there, as the Bell River comes along and joins up with the Macquarie River there, it's got to go around a corner, and natural erosion will keep eroding that. So if we did nothing, then it'll just keep chewing away at that riverbank there, and you'd end up losing more of the riverbank. It might end up getting to the stage where it starts impacting housing. So you really have to do something there, I believe, with that bank stabilisation. So if you're going to do that, well, you may as well do it to the level that you're actually doing something to make it useful for people with the roadworks.
Yeah, and of course, the other part about this is it's also a valuable road access across the river there, and should anything happen on the main bridge, you've got nowhere to go. Apart from that, it takes a lot of pressure off the highway, and at the moment there is a lot of pressure on the intersection there along the Monteviers Road where it meets the highway, and it's a fairly dangerous intersection. I think that in the end, if there was if there's nothing done with the bridge, you definitely have to do some sort of traffic management structures in there, probably a roundabout or traffic lights even. And I don't think we want that if we can avoid it.
And it was pointed out by some of the discussion that we had by councillors last night that this is not really a bridge that's just for Wellington, because as you point out, you've only got one bridge crossing across the Macquarie River there now in Wellington. If something happened there, if there was an accident there, if there was any issue there, then suddenly you've got very restricted access to the western area of New South Wales. When you go across that bridge, it's not just about accessing parts of Wellington, but then it's Dubbo and then further west. And gaining alternative access is quite difficult and not great for heavy vehicles, for example. So that all was considered as part of that process going forward. So hopefully we'll have some luck there, and I say luck, we'll be putting our professionals into it, not just crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. But I've already had discussions with Jenny Aitchison, who's the Minister for Regional Transport and Roads. We've brought this to her attention. We've talked about a couple of projects around Wellington, brought this to her attention definitely. Not that I've got a council resolution to go forward with yet, but I did say that more than likely this is the way councils would go, and wanted to make sure that she was aware of it when she was in Dubbo last week.
Okay. Now, moving on to the next subject, Matthew, we had an earlier discussion about the number of developments that are coming across the table there now at council, and I did sort of allude to the fact that it's all lumped together, and it makes it difficult for me to really get a picture on what's happening with Wellington. But there's a few ways that you have been able to look at that and say, okay, we can see things happening there. You might like to just elaborate on that.
Yeah, certainly. One of the things that's really interesting is that you've got a whole range of competing processes at the moment in place that affects development. And we have a developers forum, a regular developers forum, and we actually had that on Wednesday night this week. And some of the discussion there was quite interesting, because developers in the room were talking about the fact that interest rates are definitely having an impact on the ability for people to afford to buy a new home. So that's obviously having a downward influence on developments. You've also got building materials and building costs. There was estimations there from the developers talking about 30% to maybe 50% increase on building costs over the last few years. So you've got those things which you would think logically would be putting some downward pressure on the actual development applications coming through. So you'd expect the numbers to be dropping. But then on the flip side of that, we've got lots of people who want to move to regional areas, and we've got a renewable energy zone focused more around the Wellington area that is going to have a huge positive influence on developments in the Wellington area in particular. So you marry all that up and come up with some numbers and some data. And when you look at that, and in the papers there's a graph which people can go and look at there, it gives a very good visual indication there. But the best year ever that we've had for development applications through Dubbo was back in 2015, 2016, which was only Dubbo City Council. 488 total dwellings were approved in that particular year. Now, going forward from that after the amalgamation, the numbers dropped off, and that's interesting because you actually had Wellington numbers included in those numbers, so there was a decline in there, and maybe that was a lack of confidence after the amalgamation. And that started to pick up in some recent years. 458 we had in 21-22, 468 in 2022-2023, And then when you look at this financial year so far, what's interesting, despite the fact you've got some of those downward pressures, as I talked about with interest rates and building costs, if you look at the DAs approved so far this financial year, and I understand, Tony, it's only 2 months, but we've got that to work with, the value of those so far is up 78% based on the same period last year. So that sounds pretty good. And then if you extrapolated those numbers and went forward to the same average over the rest of the financial year, you would hit 576 total dwellings approved for the year. Now, that would be our best year ever. So that would eclipse the 2015-2016 financial year. Again, we don't know what's going to happen over the next 10 months, but based on those first 2 months, that's a positive sign. And I'm a firm believer, Tony, that what's happening, the development that's happening around the Wellington area with the res and some other developments that are happening around the Dubbo Regional Council area are really going to create so much demand that despite all those negative influences, we're going to have some very positive numbers going forward.
Yeah, I hope we do get some of that, I have to say. One interesting development I thought was the pump hydro proposition put forward by ASIN. An interesting proposition because whilst that development would be in the LGA, a lot of the infrastructure involved would be outside of it. So that's going to be an interesting one to see develop, I guess, because apparently it's going to be cheaper if you look at the cost-benefit side of it, cheaper than the cost-benefit that you would get from Snowy 2.0. So it's a more cost-effective project, should I say, than the Snowy Hydro 2.0. And I think it's a fairly large project, not far behind it.
Well, it's interesting, Tony.
Capacity, you know.
In terms of a battery, I was doing some work the other day, some research for some other different things I was working on. And in terms of storage of energy, 1 gigawatt hour of storage, so we're talking about the equivalent of battery storage now, 1 gigawatt hour of storage needs 1 gigalitre of water with a 400 metre drop. So it's a fairly effective way to store power in terms of water. So a pumped hydro scheme, having the dam there, I think is going to be very effective. And there's some work being done by some researchers at the moment looking at farm dams around different areas. And if people have got, just say, a 1 megalitre dam and they've got a pair of those within 500 metres of each other on something like a 17% slope, that can be an effective pumped hydro scheme. So you might have lots of little schemes around with farms, but that one there is going to be absolutely fantastic. And I think that sort of storage capability, I don't think people realise how much storage we've got in water that we've got in places like that. But Tony, that pumped hydro scheme is only one of 37 renewable energy projects that are in either fully or partly in our LGA. So it's a pretty exciting future.
It certainly is. And I guess a lot of people wouldn't even realise that we've got hydroelectricity being generated out of the Burrendong Dam either. So it's not contributing a hell of a lot, but it all adds up. And I think it's capable of powering Wellington all by itself when it's operating.
Yeah,
anyway.
Again, I know you're right. You're not really talking too much about the renewable energy that's generated from that, but you're right, all these little parts all add up, and that's an exciting part of what we'll be doing here. When these projects are finished, Tony, the amount of power generated from the Central West Orana Renewable Energy Zone will provide approximately 42% of the power required by the entire state. So this will really be an incredibly important part, and I believe there'll be some incredible economic benefits out of that if we play our cards right.
Yeah, okay. Now, I do notice on another report, which didn't come out of last night's meeting, that the council is making progress on the Saxa Road. There's been lots of patching work going on. When I say patching work, some of it would be very large patches, meters, maybe 100 metres long or so.
Yeah,
that's progressing.
Some heavy patching is happening out there on Saxa Road. The big solution there, of course, though, Tony, is something that we talked about previously, and it's about 16 months away, will be the replacement of that severely broken causeway with a bridge that will be up at a high enough level that it will withstand most of those floodwaters that go underneath it. So that's the big solution, and then that'll get that road back to being useful as a regional road as it should be. And that was actually another one of the projects I did speak to Jenny Aitchison about in terms of being the Minister for Regional Transport and Roads.
Okay. just before we leave this discussion, I just wanted to point out another interesting thing was that there was an audit done on signage, council signage around the LGA, and it was interesting to see about half of it's not up to scratch.
No, and that was something, actually, it's an interesting little process there. I actually was at one particular location in Dubbo, and I was just walking past a sign, and I saw some information down the bottom of that sign that was a bit out of date. And I just thought, that's a little minor annoying thing. I'll mention that to someone. And I just happened to be talking to the Deputy Mayor, Richard Ivey, and I said, I saw this sign the other day, and it just didn't look great because the information was a bit out of date. And he said that he'd seen the same thing on a few signs around Wellington. So he decided to take it further, and he brought forward a notice of motion to council and asked the staff to go and do an audit on the various signs across the LGA just to see whether some were out of date, incorrect information, maybe just wrong logos on them. And the information that we got back in the report last night was quite comprehensive. 265 signs were found to have some issue or some error on them. Now, some of them were just an old Wellington Shire Council or Dubbo City Council logo instead of Dubbo Regional Council. Not the end of the world. We've had 7 years to replace those, but again, that probably isn't the end of the world. But there were certainly signs there that had wrong information. There were signs there that had conflicting information. There was one sign, for example, that had a sign that showed that it was a loading zone through certain hours of the day, and also 1 hour parking through similar hours of the day. So if you turned up to that particular sign, you'd look at it and you'd say, oh, well, it says loading zone now and 1 hour parking. Am I allowed to park here or not? Oh, I don't know what to do. So there were things like that that were a little bit confusing for people. There were other ones that just had incorrect information on them. And so I think that was a worthwhile notice of motion to bring forward. Now the problem is that we need to replace those, repair those, fix those, maybe even remove some. But the cost of those, well, we've got to put that into a forward budget. We do have some signs that are being replaced in the near future that were already budgeted, but we'll have to budget those sign fix-up in a future budget, but also looking at ones that might need to have urgent information fixed up, like that one that had conflicting information about parking or 1 hour parking in a loading zone. So there's ones like that we might have to fix up straight away, but the good part is we'll start to collate this information and make changes to it going forward.
Okay. Matthew, I think the mayoral elections are coming up very soon. So what's happening with that?
28th of September, the way the council works normally in a normal 4-year term, this has been a shorter term after being affected by COVID with the elections there, but a normal 4-year term would see our council area have the mayor and the deputy mayor elected at the very beginning of that term, and then after 2 years you would have another election for the mayor and deputy mayor again for the final 2 years of the term. This one's been a little bit different. The election occurred in December 2021, so the first term of the mayor and deputy mayor is effectively 1 year and 9 months. On the 28th of September, so this month, a couple of weeks away, will be another election for the mayor and the deputy mayor, and that will only be a 1 year term because we've got the full election happening next year again. This term was shortened by COVID. So on the 28th of September, then I'll have to, if I want to be the mayor going forward from there, I'll have to put my hand up again, be nominated by 2 other councillors, and then stand for election. And again, it's a democracy, so any one of the other 10 councillors or more than one of those 10 can put their hand up to be the mayor as well, and again go through that election process. And then the deputy mayor, the same thing. We've got to decide whether we want to have the position of deputy mayor again and then elect a deputy mayor again through that democratic process amongst the 10 councillors.
Okay. And we've been talking to Matthew Dickerson, the Mayor of Dubbo Regional Council on Binjang 91.5. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Tony.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.